Welcome to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. I'm Rebecca Elliott. At the time of this episode being published, we're just a couple of weeks away from May, which marks the official start of the influenza season in Australia. So what can we expect from the upcoming flu season? And when is the best time to get your annual flu vaccine? Joining me today to answer these questions and more is Professor Kanta Subbarao. Kanta is a virologist and physician and director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza at the Doherty Institute, one of only 5 centres around the world. Kanta, welcome back to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back.
Now let's start with the basics. What is influenza?
So influenza is an acute illness, usually sudden onset, and it's characterized by respiratory symptoms and systemic symptoms like fever, headache, and body aches and muscle aches. Along with respiratory symptoms, it could go from sore throat, cough, runny nose, and so on. It usually lasts a few days. People get better, but it can be quite severe and can be associated with complications. It's caused by a group of viruses that we call influenza viruses. So both the name of the disease and the name of the viruses are influenza.
We'll get into those shortly, no doubt. So just how severe can it be?
So influenza can be a mild illness in some people, but it can be severe particularly in people at the extremes of age, so very young infants and children, and the older adults, as well as people with underlying health conditions. And severe influenza can actually occur at any age, in addition, which is why we emphasize a seasonal vaccine program, and we could talk about that later. So every year we have an influenza season or an influenza epidemic that is associated with hospitalization for pneumonia and influenza. And sometimes people are admitted with cardiac conditions or worsening of cardiac conditions. So people can be admitted to hospital. Some people get admitted directly to the intensive care unit. And every year we have a number of people that die of influenza, ranging in age from children, sadly, and all the way to older adults. So at the two extremes of age, and really at any age in between, we can have severe influenza.
What treatment options are available?
So the best is prevention, and that is with influenza vaccines. But there are antiviral drugs, and we really currently have 3 classes of drugs. Unfortunately, one class of drugs doesn't work anymore. So we have 2 classes of drugs that are referred to as the neuraminidase inhibitors and polymerase inhibitors. They're both available to treat influenza A and influenza B infections.
As I mentioned, the flu season is about to begin here in Australia. What does cause the seasonality?
That's a great question. We don't fully understand why influenza is a seasonal illness. We do know that the ability of the virus to survive in the environment is improved in colder weather, colder, drier air, but it's also people's behavior. People stay indoors more, allowing a greater opportunity for transmission of respiratory viruses. But we really don't know where the virus goes in between. And certainly in the tropical belt of the world, influenza can be a year-round illness or can have 2 peaks. So it's really only in the temperate climates that it's a winter illness.
When we last spoke on the podcast back in April 2021, COVID was rife, and you may recall, and in fact caused the flu season to pretty much disappear in 2020. What effect has it had in subsequent years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we did really go for almost 2 years with almost no influenza activity, certainly no influenza activity in Australia, and very little influenza activity around the world from about March or April of 2020 into 2022. However, when we looked very hard, there were pockets of influenza still going on through that period, mainly in the tropical belt. However, what are the consequences of it? So influenza viruses, when we talk about influenza, there are 2 influenza A strains called H1N1 and H3N2, and 2 influenza B lineages called B Yamagata and B Victoria lineage. Now, there's a lot of genetic and antigenic diversity amongst these viruses, and it's the reason why we update the influenza vaccines each year. But when SARS coronavirus 2 emerged and the COVID-19 pandemic was going on, it forced the viruses into what we refer to as a genetic bottleneck. So we were very curious about what would happen when influenza reemerged, as it did. And two things have happened. One is that it's taken a while for the seasonality, the usual seasonality, to reestablish itself. So in the past 2 years, we've had influenza season begin much earlier and carry on for much longer.
So when's it sort of started?
So in the last year, we started seeing influenza in March and April, and we kept seeing it down to October, November, December.
So it's a longer season.
Yes, so much longer season than usual. And this has been seen worldwide in other countries as well. What I think we're starting to see is that it's gradually returning to the, quote, normal seasonality. The second thing that's happened, as I referred to, was that the viruses were put under an enormous genetic bottleneck. So we were curious to see what would come out at the end. And what we've seen is that genetic diversity that occurred before the pandemic has narrowed down. Now, we don't have quite so many clades or subclades of viruses co-circulating. They've narrowed down, and now they're starting to diversify again. And one thing that's happened is the B. Yamagata lineage viruses have not reemerged after the pandemic. So the last influenza B Yamagata lineage virus that we've seen around the world was from 2020.
That's remarkable. What do we think has caused that?
So I think that there's been some competition between the B Victoria lineage and B Yamagata lineage viruses for some time, and there was less diversity in the B Yamagata lineage viruses. So maybe they were losing the fight anyway, but the consequence of this bottleneck with no circulation of influenza for 2 years has, and when viruses reemerged, the B Victoria lineage viruses reemerged, but not the B Yamagata.
So it's about sort of survival of the fittest?
In a sense, yes, because all of the changes that occur in these viruses in nature, fitness is an important attribute in terms of what actually becomes a dominant strain.
So is it possible that we could see it reemerge in the future?
We've considered that, and I think the WHO is very cautious in saying when a virus has really been eradicated, so we're not using the eradicated word yet. I think you have to look very hard and make sure you've looked very extensively. But I think we're confident now that it's not sitting around in pockets and that the surveillance activity has been strong enough and robust enough over these past few years for us to have some confidence that it's not circulating.
That's great news. Now, we talked about the last year's season being a longer season. What can we expect from this year's season? Have we started to see cases emerge already?
So that's, most influenza virologists know better than to predict.
And that's exactly what you said in the last podcast.
We don't predict, but we can certainly learn from what's happened in our previous season as well as what's happening in the northern hemisphere season. And I think that influenza viruses are getting back into their normal seasonality. So if I were to predict, and I'm not predicting, I think I would anticipate that we might have a more normal season than we did before. Now, having said that, I will say that we continued to see influenza activity into December of last year. So it was a very, very long season. But I think that we're headed towards a more conventional season.
So one of the key roles of the WHO Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza is to make recommendations on which strains to include in the annual vaccine. Firstly, you did touch on this briefly before, but why do we need an annual vaccine?
So we need an annual vaccine for two reasons. One is that the viruses continue to evolve in nature. So influenza viruses are RNA-containing viruses, and their RNA machinery that copies itself cannot correct mistakes. So there are mistakes made in the genome, and when the virus emerges, it can have mutations in multiple locations. In addition, there is pressure for the virus to escape the immunity from previous infection and previous vaccination. So this is an ongoing phenomenon. It happens year round, and we need to update the vaccines to keep up with that. The second reason is that influenza vaccine, the immunity induced by influenza vaccines lasts about a year. And so we have very strain-specific immunity from our currently licensed vaccines. And so we need to revaccinate each year. And we take advantage of that opportunity to update the strains in the vaccine to provide optimal protection against what is likely to circulate.
So how does that process actually work for selecting these strains?
So the WHO has established a global influenza surveillance and response system that has over 150 laboratories in more than 110 countries that continuously monitor and report to the WHO on influenza activity in their regions. They also forward viruses to be characterized from each region, and these viruses go to one of 5 WHO collaborating centers, of which our center at the Doherty Institute is one. So we typically evaluate 3,000 to 5,000 viruses a year. We look at their genetic characteristics and their antigenic characteristics. We look to see if they're sensitive to available antiviral drugs. And we put all of this information together in collaboration with the other collaborating centers and the WHO essential regulatory labs. And we might meet twice a year, once in September, to make a recommendation for the composition of vaccines for the Southern Hemisphere, and at the end of February for a recommendation on the composition of vaccines for the Northern Hemisphere.
So based on what you described earlier, is B. Yamagata still included in this year's vaccine?
Yes, it is. And the vaccine manufacturers and regulators are in close conversation working towards removing the B. Yamagata lineage from the vaccine. It is our opinion as people that are consultants to the WHO and many other members of the academic community feel that we should not be worried about B. Yamagata viruses. They do not represent a community risk, and therefore they should be removed from the vaccines as soon as possible. However, removing vaccines from removing a component from the vaccine is not a simple matter. It has to do with the licenses and the production of vaccine. So therefore, the regulators and manufacturers are working towards that.
And what is the benefit of actually taking out a strain from the vaccine? Just the fact that we just don't need it?
That's right. The benefit is that we simply don't need it. There may be a benefit in terms of the cost of the vaccine and potentially in the number of doses available. So there are theoretical advantages. In addition, there's a very small theoretical risk for people that are working with large amounts of the virus while they're manufacturing. But the more likely benefits are that we might have more doses of a trivalent vaccine than we do of a quadrivalent vaccine, and potentially the costs might come down. And we won't be including a component that isn't needed.
So when is the best time to get your flu vaccine?
Great question.
We'll have the answer to that question in just a moment, but just a quick break to say that if you're enjoying this podcast, why not share it with your family and friends or rate and review on your favourite podcasting app? And now back to the show.
The immunity from vaccination is elicited about 2 weeks after vaccination. So we want people to be vaccinated about 2 weeks before they're exposed to influenza. So having said that, and vaccine-induced immunity lasts about 6 months or give or take a bit. So I think it's a prediction based on when the virus is likely to start circulating. So in the conventional Australian season, vaccination in late April or May provides good coverage for the duration and the peak of the influenza season. As I've said, the last 2 seasons we've had influenza activity earlier than usual. And so in those cases, you wouldn't have wanted to wait till May.
Except that we didn't know.
Exactly. So that's the challenging part. The other thing is that vaccines become available on the private market. And when employers deliver the vaccine, then they stick to a certain schedule. But vaccines are also available on the private market and get advertised quite widely. And so there are people that line up to get vaccinated very early. But there may be some benefit in waiting if there isn't a indication that the season is starting earlier than usual.
Well, I think I'm scheduled for the next 2 weeks, so hopefully I've got it right. The last time you were on this podcast, you shared insights on cell-based influenza vaccines, which are available for free to vulnerable Australians for the first time this year through the National Immunisation Program. Firstly, can you remind us what a cell-based vaccine is and why is this significant?
Yeah, so the vast majority of the influenza vaccine that is manufactured globally is manufactured in embryonated hen's eggs. It's an old technology. It's been very widely used, and the vaccine is quite inexpensive. However, when you take an influenza virus that comes out of somebody's throat and put it into an egg, there are mutations that occur as the virus adapts to grow to high titer in eggs. Some of those mutations may be in areas that affect the hemagglutinin, which is the protein that the vaccine-induced immunity is targeting. So people have thought for a while about making the influenza vaccine in an alternative substrate, avoiding eggs, so that we avoid those egg-based adaptation mutations. And so the cell-based vaccines and recombinant vaccines avoid the passage of the virus in embryonated hen's eggs. And so cell-based vaccines are available, and recombinant vaccines are available not so much in Australia, but in other parts of the world. And both of those vaccines avoid the potential for egg adaptation mutations.
Right. And when might we see these cell-based vaccines available to the wider population?
They are currently available. In fact, I've been getting it for the last several years, but I have to go to get it on the private market. So a lot of the employer-based and other public programs do not offer it currently. It is a bit more expensive than the egg-based vaccines, but they are available. You have to go looking.
So where is flu vaccine technology headed? There's this idea of a universal flu vaccine, for example. Can you explain to me what that is?
Yeah, so there are two major areas of development for influenza vaccines. One is to try newer technologies. So I've just mentioned cell-based and recombinant, but mRNA vaccines, which we learned about during the COVID pandemic, mRNA technology is being applied to influenza vaccines as well. So there'll be changes in the future with the platform that's used to develop influenza vaccines. We also have vaccines that are enhanced for the elderly that include adjuvants, and we may see more use of adjuvants in the future. So we have changes in the platform, in adjuvants, and then the third part is to try to increase the breadth of vaccination. And so there's been a lot of interest in what are called universal influenza vaccines that would cover all influenza A viruses or potentially both influenza A and influenza B viruses, so that you could get one vaccine instead of having all these different components. You could have one vaccine and you wouldn't have to get it updated each year because the vaccine technology would target a part of the virus that doesn't change each year. So that is the holy grail, to have a vaccine that doesn't need to be updated, that would work against an avian virus or a human virus or a swine virus. However, so although the science is really exciting, we aren't there yet. There's a lot of work in that space. So I think if I were to predict, we will see more changes in the platforms for influenza vaccines and the use of adjuvants before we actually get to a universal influenza vaccine.
Data from 2023 found that vaccination rates were as low as 16% for the 5 to 15 years age group. What message do you have for people contemplating whether or not to get their vaccine for 2024?
Yeah, I think that we really need to get the message out that influenza vaccine can prevent severe illness and death. We had childhood deaths in Australia with very, very low rates of vaccination and very high rates of illness in children. So I think we do need to improve the vaccination coverage because influenza vaccines can prevent severe illness and death.
Now, on the podcast recently, we had Dr. Michelle Villa on to talk about avian influenza that's been circulating globally, and we'll pop that in the show notes. But just last week, we heard that it had been transmitted to cows in the US and a dairy farmer worker had also been infected. Do we need to be concerned about this?
Well, I mean, anytime we hear about an avian influenza virus that crosses the species barrier into mammalian species, it raises concerns. And certainly dairy cows being infected is a new observation. I have not seen scientific reports about the infections in dairy cows, but I've seen what the U.S. Department of Agriculture has reported, sort of publicly, and it appears that their cows were symptomatic and there was potentially some transmission between the cows, although they're looking into that. The Centers for Disease Control has a WHO Collaborating Center for Influenza, sister WHOCC to us, and they have shared the information that they have with us as well as with the WHO GISRA system. And they are currently continue to assess the risk to humans as low. But as I said, each such incursion into a new mammalian species is cause for concern because there's then potential for more exposure of people.
Now, I can't let you go without talking about your recent grant from the Novo Nordisk Foundation to develop a new antiviral drug to counter influenza. Congratulations. Can you tell me a little bit more about this project?
Yeah, this is a really exciting opportunity to carry on the development of a drug. This is a collaboration between the University of Melbourne and an Australian biotech company called AusBio. And it builds on work that's been going on for some years now. The collaboration from the University of Melbourne side in the past was led by Professor Lorena Brown and Charlie Mackenzie-Cludas. So we're going to continue that work and try to take these drugs and develop a preclinical package of information to enable clinical development of this drug. So it's a very exciting new approach. We have some information. We're trying to round out that information over the next 2 years with support from the Novo Nordisk Foundation.
Well, that sounds very exciting indeed, Kanta. Good luck with it all. And it was great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you for listening to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. If there is a specific topic you would like us to cover, please get in touch with us by emailing doherty-media@unimel.edu.au. That's doherty-media@unimel.edu.au. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please rate and review on your favourite podcasting app and subscribe if you haven't already. The Doherty Institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. See you next time.